The story of the Protestant Reformation is truly an amazing event in the history of Western civilization. In the 16th century, there was an eruption of ideas that shook the world as it was then known, and the aftershocks of that Reformation, of that historical event, continue to this very day. As I go around on each circulation of the turning of the carousel, I see a statue that is to the honor of Johannes Gutenberg. And on the paper that he holds in his hand, it says, "And there was light." Of course, those words are taken from the Bible. The Bible tells us that God created all things. And He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And the very first printing that Gutenberg did was the Bible itself. 180 copies that he eventually printed in Mainz, but he developed the technology to do it here in Strasbourg.
And the distribution of Bibles became a crucial factor as background to the Reformation.
And this Bible that began to be read began to create people who could ask the question, is what the Pope teaching really the teaching of the Apostle Paul? Is the Roman Catholic theology really the teaching of the Word of God found in the Holy Scriptures?
Prior to when Calvin came in 1536, Geneva was a Catholic city, a town of about 10,000 people. 700 monks and priests were living in town, and very corrupt. It is said that many of those men were simply just doing Catholic functions. Many of them were illiterate. Actually, quite a few of them had concubines, and so that kind of gives you a general idea of the morality of the church. At the same time, people like William Farel, Froment, Viret, these guys were coming to Geneva, and they were coming with the Bible. And they were beginning to do Bible studies, bringing the Word of God here. And as people listened to these preachers of the Word, as they saw what the church was doing, there was obviously a contradiction in their minds, and sooner, very quickly, they began to realize, wow, the Word of God is miles away from what is happening, and they were then drawn to the Word of God by the very corruption that they saw in the Catholic Church.
John Knox left Geneva, went back to his beloved Scotland, with the desire that God would give him Scotland or else that he would die. What he meant by God giving him Scotland was that he would be able to reclaim Scotland for the gospel, that he would be able to preach the good news of the cross and the empty tomb. And God gave John Knox that privilege to do that in Scotland.
Standing against Queen Mary of Scotland, he prays that God will bring a reformation. And according to the legend, Queen Mary says, "I fear nothing more than the prayers of John Knox." John Knox had an attitude that said, if God is on your side, you are a majority. And as he entered into the life of Edinburgh, the great city where his ministry unfolded, he left his imprint on every one of the great places that still dominate the horizon of the city. But by the time the Reformation was done, this expansive city had been reached with the Reformed faith emanating from Geneva and underneath the influence of John Calvin's theology, but is applied by John Knox. As we look out here, we can see various places, such as the steeples, all in the distance, representing Reformed churches. There you'll find St. Giles and Greyfriars Church. On the distant hill, we can see Edinburgh Castle, where the royalty often found themselves wrestling with what would be the next issues that they would have to defend for their country. At the bottom, at Holyrood Castle, that's where John Knox often met with Mary, Queen of the Scots, as they debated Roman Catholic and Protestant theology. We can also see other sites in Geneva that are historic and significant. Perhaps one of the most painful is the site that is remembered or an anti-Trinitarian by the name of Miguel Servetus, who was burned at the stake.
Y de hecho, pues las escrituras del padre.
My name is Sergio Baches, and I'm the director of the Michael Servetus Institute in Spain. The institute is located in the birth house of Michael Servetus in the little town of Villanueva de Sigena.
He was a medical doctor who had been influenced by some of the anti-Trinitarian thought coming from the Italian Reformation that was very radical in some senses, where they threw out Nicene theology. And Servetus began to teach the view that Jesus was not the eternal Son of God. He began to write books on this theme. He began to be a marked man all across Europe, whether in Lutheran lands, Roman Catholic lands, or Reformed lands. He was someone who was under the possibility of capital punishment for breaking the law by teaching an anti-Trinitarian theology. Well, he took the risk to come to Geneva. He came to Geneva and he was discovered, and he was in fact tried. Now, the thesis that is often heard is that Calvin was the one that put him to death, but it's more complex than that.
And though, Servetus' death is tragic in a way, you got to remember that it was a city hall decision. It was a city's decision to burn him at the stake for heresy. Calvin had tried to go and plead with Servetus to change his mind. And Calvin actually pleaded for a lighter sentence than Servetus.
Calvin wanted him to be beheaded, a much more humane way of dying. But they insisted that he be burned at the stake. And so Servetus was burned at the stake. As we look back from this vantage point in time, we can see that as one of the tragic expressions of the Reformation.
Indeed, I would say that Servetus' ethical example and Servetus' death was like a spark that produced a really heated debate on freedom of conscience. And there were several philosophers and reformers, curiously, some of them coming from the north of Italy, who openly and sometimes harshly criticized Calvin for instigating the death of Servetus. And that was something which probably was unseen in the previous years.
It's important to remember that there was a man named John Calvin who faced great tragedy and difficulty, often wondered if his life would make any difference at all. But in the sovereign plan of God, there was not a small person named John Calvin, nor are there any small people today. As we are faithful to our calling where God has called us, we are part of an infinite plan of God's eternal purpose. And when we know that, we can look at this place and be encouraged and say, if God could use a man in what was then a very small ministry for such long-standing impact, He can use us too, and will, because He is that sovereign God that Calvin so taught us to worship.
As we take this pilgrimage through the life of John Calvin and medieval and Reformation Europe, the challenge is, are you living at this moment in time for the glory of Christ alone? If you understand the heart and mind of John Calvin, that will become your goal. You'll begin to take your heart and lift it promptly and sincerely to God, so that He alone might have the glory in you.